Yeah, he's a good guy.
I've been saying that.
But turns out, we're not so good.
Maybe when you grow up a little bit, you'll learn to communicate a little better.
You wanted a young husband. Deal with it. You know what? I wish we never met.
I think the worst part of this story would be the old secret, the attempted kiss. The messy triangle with Michael hanging over everything like a bad decision nobody wanted to name out loud, but it actually gets uglier faster than that, because the moment that really changes the temperature is not some confession from the past, it is the present-day humiliation of Laura standing there and realizing that Beeran is not treating this like a fight they can talk through. He is treating it like a full collapse of trust, and suddenly the woman who helped pay for the apartment is the one. Being pushed out of it, which is exactly why this moment lands so hard, because it does not feel like normal relationship anger anymore. It feels like the kind of shift that tells you somebody has already moved from hurt into action, and once that happens, the whole story stops being about feelings alone and starts becoming about power. That is what makes Laura's reaction so important here, because you can feel that she walks into this thinking she is still dealing with tension, jealousy, maybe another uncomfortable conversation about Michael, but not this level of coldness, not this level of finality, and definitely not the kind of mood where Beeran already sounds like he has put the whole relationship on trial and reached a verdict before she even catches up to what he knows. Because the second she realizes Michael told him the truth about her making a move in the past, the ground shifts under her completely. And what had probably lived in her mind as old history, inconvenient but manageable, suddenly becomes the one piece of information that reorders the entire relationship. And that is where the real question starts creeping in. Because, yes, Beeran has a reason to feel blindsided. Yes, Laura clearly withheld something that mattered, especially because Michael was not just some random name from her past, but the exact person Beeran already saw as a threat. But even with that being true, the way Beeran responds makes the whole thing more complicated, because he is not just wounded, he is controlled, sharp, distant, almost too ready to turn betrayal into authority, and that raises a bigger issue than whether Laura lied, because now the audience has to sit with something far more uncomfortable, which is whether this man is reacting from heartbreak alone, or whether the heartbreak instantly handed him a new advantage, and he knows it. That is why this opening works so well, because it throws 6 questions at the viewer almost at once without needing to spell them out like a lecture nobody asked for, since now we are wondering why Michael finally spoke up, whether Laura ever planned to tell the truth on her own, whether she hid it to protect a friendship or because she knew it looked worse than she wanted to admit, whether Beeran is devastated or strategic, and why this apartment situation already feels bigger than the original secret itself, because once the fight moves from words into who stays and who leaves, this is no longer just an argument about honesty, it is a fight over control. And Laura still seems to think she can explain her way out of it, even as the story is quietly becoming something much harder to survive. The first easy reading of this fight is that Laura is obviously wrong and Beeran is obviously justified. And to be fair, that reading does not come out of nowhere, because she did hide something that directly involved the one man he already felt uneasy about, which is exactly why the moment hits him so hard. But the reason this section works is because it does not stay simple for very long, and the second Laura starts defending herself, the whole thing gets murkier in a way that makes the conflict more watchable and honestly more dangerous, because now this is not just about one hidden moment. From the past, it is about how both of them define betrayal when they are the one under pressure. Laura's argument, at least on the surface, is pretty clear and probably familiar to a lot of viewers who have ever tried to bury an uncomfortable truth and convince themselves it no longer matters. Because in her mind, this happened before Beeran. It was old history. It went nowhere, and it did not deserve the level of emotional weight he is suddenly putting on it now. So from her point of view, the real crime here is not the old attempted kiss, it is the way he is dragging something dead into the present and acting like it rewrites everything. And that is why she keeps trying to shrink it, calling it small, treating it like some dusty mistake that should have stayed buried. But the more she minimizes it, the worse she makes herself look, because for Beeran the kiss is not the center of the wound at all. The concealment is, and that difference matters more than Laura seems willing to admit in the moment. Then the story gets sharper, because Laura quietly says the one thing that changes how the audience reads her, And she does it without even seeming to realize how much damage it does. Because once she admits that she kept this from Beeran because she thought he would interfere with her friendship with Michael, she destroys the idea that this was just harmless old news that slipped through the cracks, since now it sounds deliberate, strategic, chosen, and that makes her look less like someone protecting peace and more like someone trying to control which truths count and which ones get buried until somebody else exposes them first. But here is where the story gets annoyingly human, because that same confession also plants a second possibility that does not let Beeran walk out of this looking pure either. Since if Laura really believed he would use that truth to start policing her friendship, then maybe she was not only hiding guilt, maybe she was also reacting to a pattern she already saw coming. And that is where this fight becomes about competing meanings, because Laura treats omission like self-protection, while Beeran treats omission like disloyalty, and both of those positions can hold some truth at the same time, even while both people are still making the situation worse. That is why her anger matters too, because once she starts throwing his past secrets back at him and acting like he owes her a pass, this stops being an honest defense and starts sounding like scorekeeping. And scorekeeping is usually what happens when two people are not building trust at all. They are just waiting for the moment they can cash in each other's failures, and by the time she throws out the age and communication insult, the fight is no longer about facts anyway. It is about ego, humiliation, and who gets to define what counts as betrayal, which is exactly why the next phase gets even messier. Because once Michael moves from background threat to active player, the whole moral balance shifts again. This is the point where the story stops looking like a couples fight and starts looking like what it probably was all along, which is a triangle that nobody fully wanted to define, because leaving it blurry gave each person something useful. And once Laura storms over to Michael instead of sitting in the wreckage with Beeran, that choice alone says a lot more than she probably realizes, because now the man who was supposed to be the outside problem becomes the center of the entire emotional mess, and suddenly the audience is no longer sorting out one betrayal, they are trying to decode 3 different motives at the same time. Laura comes in hot, and honestly, that tracks, because from her point of view, Michael just detonated her relationship by saying out loud the one thing she kept buried, so now she wants answers. But even here, the scene does not stay clean for long, because Michael's explanation is frustratingly believable in the way that makes reality TV chaos so sticky. He says Beeran would not let it go, that he kept pushing, kept circling back, kept needing reassurance that Michael was not secretly in love with Laura, and Michael claims he finally told the truth because he wanted to end the suspicion once and for all, and make clear that he was not trying to take her away. On paper, that sounds fair. It sounds mature. It sounds like the kind of thing a person says when they are trying to clear their own name and remove themselves from the middle. But this is where the whole thing gets slippery, because a statement can be technically honest and still carry a very convenient kind of power, and that is exactly what makes Michael hard to read here, since the moment he speaks, he is no longer just the misunderstood friend in the background. He becomes the person with the information, the person with the leverage, the person who can define the emotional temperature between Laura and Beeran without even being in the relationship himself. And once Laura accuses him of sabotage, the audience is forced to consider something uglier than simple honesty, which is whether Michael told the truth to clear the air, or whether some part of him liked being the guy in the middle just a little too much. What makes that accusation land harder is that Laura does not exactly protect herself when she starts talking, because instead of locking the boundary down and making Michael sound obviously irrelevant, she starts exposing how messy this connection may have always been. And the second she admits there were layers there, the whole frame changes, because now Beeran's suspicion does not look wildly jealous anymore. It looks like something he may have sensed before he could prove it, and that makes this whole triangle feel less like one sudden misunderstanding and more like a structure that was emotionally unstable from the start. That is the real tension here. Because Michael talks like a man with boundaries, Laura talks like a woman defending a friendship, and Beeran talks like someone who has been wronged. But none of those roles stay pure once you look at the behavior underneath them, and that is why this section creates so much division, because viewers are left asking whether Michael was stepping back or stepping in, whether Laura always knew this bond was blurry, whether Beeran's obsession with Michael came from insecurity or intuition, and whether the ugliest part of this story is that everyone involved may have been telling some version of the truth while still making the situation worse, which is why Michael's advice at the end matters so much, because for the first time, someone says the simple thing Laura should have done from the start: acknowledge Beeran's feelings. But by now, the real question is whether that can still fix anything when the emotional damage has already turned into leverage. This is where the story stops being a loud emotional fight and turns into something colder, because once Laura leaves Michael and finally starts to understand what she should have done from the beginning, the energy shifts from denial into damage control. And that sounds like progress on paper, until you realize she may have reached that clarity a little too late. Because by now, Beeran is no longer in the mood for explanation, no longer in the mood for debate, and definitely no longer in the mood to reward a delayed apology just because it finally sounds more mature than the argument. That came before it. That is what makes this part hit harder than the earlier fight, because earlier, both of them were still in the chaos of reaction, saying reckless things, defending themselves badly, throwing pain back and forth in a way that still felt messy and emotional, and maybe even reversible. But now, the mess starts hardening into structure, and structure is always more dangerous in a relationship breakdown because it means someone has already begun deciding what happens next. And in this case, that person is Beeran, who has shifted from arguing his pain to managing the consequences of it. And that is not a small difference, because once one person controls the next move, the entire emotional balance changes. Laura finally gets the point now, or at least enough of it to realize that minimizing the lie only made the wound bigger, and that if she has any chance of calming this down, she has to stop defending the past and start acknowledging the present, which is really the first emotionally smart move she has made in this whole spiral. But the problem is timing. And timing in these situations matters more than people want to admit, because insight that arrives after the explosion often looks less like growth and more like fear. And Beeran clearly is not in a place where he wants to reward late understanding. So when she reaches out, hoping to talk, hoping maybe to steady the damage before it gets worse, he shuts the door almost immediately. And that short rejection matters, because it tells the audience this is no longer about hearing her out, it is about him deciding how much access she still gets. Then comes the part that changes the whole moral temperature of the story, because "I need space" sounds reasonable until real logistics get involved, and once that phrase becomes a housing decision instead of an emotional request, the wound picks up a whole new layer of meaning. Since now, Laura is not just being kept at emotional distance, she is being physically displaced, sent out of the apartment she helped pay for while Beeran stays put. And that is the moment where a lot of viewers are going to pause and rethink what they are watching. Because yes, his hurt may be real. Yes, her lie may have been serious. But once he becomes the one who stays, the one who keeps the comfort, the one who avoids the hotel cost while she absorbs it, pain starts looking a lot more like leverage. And that is the dangerous line running through this whole section. Because now the audience has to wrestle with questions that are a lot harder than who lied, since we are suddenly dealing with whether Beeran is truly taking time to process or quietly testing how desperate Laura will become. Whether this move makes forgiveness less likely because it adds humiliation on top of betrayal, whether Laura's new apology would come from genuine clarity or straight panic, and whether this relationship was always going to expose a control issue the second one person had a justified reason to. Seize the upper hand, which is why by the end of this section the central question gets even sharper than before, because the real issue may no longer be whether Laura broke trust, but whether that broken trust revealed a relationship that turns punitive the moment power changes hands. By the end of this story, the easiest mistake would be to hand out one clean verdict and pretend the whole thing can be solved by deciding who was right, who was wrong, and who deserves the last word, but that would flatten the real damage in a way this situation does not deserve. Because the truth is a lot less neat and a lot more uncomfortable than that, and the clearest reading is not that Laura was right or Beeran was right, it is that the old secret lit the fire, and then each person made a different choice once fear, humiliation, and control entered the room. And those choices are what actually turned this into something bigger than a jealous fight. Laura was wrong, and there is not much point dancing around that just to make the ending sound softer than it is, because she hit a past move involving the exact man Beeran already saw as a threat, and once that truth came out through somebody else instead of through her, the trust collapse was not only predictable, It was almost inevitable, especially because she kept minimizing it instead of understanding why the concealment mattered more than the age of the incident itself, and that part is important because it answers one of the biggest questions hanging over the whole conflict, which is whether she ever would have told the truth on her own, and the honest answer is probably not, unless pressure forced her there. But that does not hand Beeran a clean moral win either, because his hurt can be real and still become useful to him, and that is exactly what this situation exposed, since the second he had a justified reason to feel betrayed, he moved fast into a position of control. Emotional control first, then practical control, and once the apartment decision happened, the story stopped being only about honesty and started being about punishment too, which is why his pain should be taken seriously without pretending it cancels the power move, because those two things can exist at the same time. And that is what makes this harder to dismiss as simple heartbreak. Then there is Michael, who probably benefits the most from any lazy reading, because he just told the truth sounds clean and reasonable until you step back and look at the role he occupied in this relationship long before the reveal. Because even if he was not actively trying to steal Laura away, his place in her emotional life was never neutral enough to keep the situation stable, and once Laura herself starts admitting there were layers in that bond, it becomes impossible to treat him as some innocent bystander who just happened to be standing near the explosion when it went off. So the final answer is not that one person ruined everything. It is that all three were feeding one unstable setup from different directions. Laura wanted freedom without full transparency. Beeran wanted loyalty, but may also have wanted authority the moment disloyalty was proven. Michael wanted to look clear and reasonable, but stayed central in a connection that was already too loaded to be harmless. And that is why, even if this relationship continues on the surface, even if they talk again, even if they try to smooth it over and call it growth, the deeper structure has already changed. Because now, trust is tangled up with fear, apology is tangled up with desperation, and any reunion after. This would have to answer a much darker question than whether they still care about each other, which is whether what they rebuild would actually be love or just damage that has learned how to speak more softly.